Welcome to episode 57 of No Rares Required, where I focus mostly on the commons and uncommons that you see most in a draft. And this week we'll be covering Dimir Descend. Every week I do an in-depth guide to a specific archetype, and this week Dimir Descend won the vote. It's the top performing black archetype, but black has not been performing very well. Black's strengths are single point removal, and in a set where cards are multiple cards in one, or have like Discover and can be multiple cards in one, you fall behind trying to answer your opponent's threats one for one. This is why I recommend trying to be as aggressive as you can instead of taking a controlling approach. I've seen masters like Sam Black do quite well in control, but I do prefer a different approach, as I will cover. This is a draft skeleton limited to 15 commons, 7 uncommons, and 1 rare. Since this podcast is available on multiple platforms, some of which are audio only, I'll walk through each card and discuss some alternatives. But my overall takeaway is focus on tempo, and you want the game to be over before your opponent starts flipping clay-fired bricks or dropping big dinosaurs. With blue, you have access to decent flyers, but Oaken Siren doesn't perform quite as well since you have lower artifact synergies than an Azorius or Izzet. You don't have the pirate synergies as well. So what does black have to offer? And the answer is 2 mythic level uncommons, Chupacabra Echo, and Deep Cavern Bat. And sadly, not much else. So much so, I don't recommend getting into the archetype without them. However, at least for the time being, you can take advantage that no one wants to draft black, so you can see some of those commons quite late. And I just did the Arena Open Day 2, and when you have more competitive pod, then you have to look for underdrafted strategies, and you can take advantage of black in that case. Your best removal is Join the Dead, and is the reason why I built the skeleton to be majority black. Now, on a side note, if you do decide to take a more controlling approach, be sure to include plenty of 1 and 2 drops in your curve. This set wants to start things off on turn 1, and you'll fall too far behind if your first play is on turn 3. Remember to hit like and subscribe for daily Magic the Gathering content, and come visit YouTube if you want to place your vote for the next archetype. And with that, let's get started. So my top performing blue common is Waterwind Scout, which is a 2/2 flyer for 3. When it enters the battlefield, create a map token. This card has just been a top performer in every blue archetype. Being able to use the map token to turn it into a 3/3 flyer and trigger an Explorer or find a land drop has just been really good, and it's not just a Windrake. And you can also do different things with that artifact, like if you have the Zoetic Glyph at uncommon, you can turn it into a 5/4 that discovers for 3 when it dies. My top performing black common is Tithing Blade, and Tithing Blade is an artifact for 1 and a black. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature, and then you can craft with the creature for 4 and a black to turn it into Consuming Sepulture, which is an artifact at the beginning of your upkeep. Each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And similarly to there's a fair amount of cards that leave artifacts behind that have been just typical. Like this would have been an Edict sorcery, right? And we look at like the -2/-2 enchantment in black is usually a sorcery, and in this one it's an enchantment so that it can be a permanent and affect Descend. And similarly, this gives you some artifacts that you can use for crafting later, and is an Edict. And it's a little bit matchup dependent, because if you end up against mono white, for example, that has or a white archetype, for example, then you can have trouble if they're playing like Tinkering Totes. But there's not usually multiple creatures on the battlefield by turn 2, so you generally want to try to use this early to answer your opponent's like 2-drop. And then you got an artifact left over that can give you some late game value. Yeah, Consuming Sepulture can end the game if you are in a really controlling space. And then we've got Inverted Iceberg, and I've enjoyed Inverted Iceberg anytime that I'm playing blue. The mill a card and draw a card is nice in this one because you do care. There are a few Descend strategies, but I do think Descend overall is somewhat of a trap. So you want to be kind of careful about what you are selectively putting into your deck when it comes to Descend. But what's nice about this is that it helps. It cycles. It's card neutral, and then later it has the ability to craft into the Iceberg Titan, which is a 6/6. When it attacks, you may tap or untap target artifact or creature, and is a great mid-range threat. I've also really enjoyed the Erasca Puzzle Door, which is a 1 blue artifact. Sacrifice the Puzzle Door, tap 1 colorless and tap it. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 of those cards into your graveyard and the other into your hand. And this is kind of like Sleight of Hand, but instead of... So we played Sleight of Hand in the last set with like blue-red, where you cared about the number of spells in your hand, right, or in your graveyard. And so in this set, what you're doing is you're doing this to trigger more stuff into your graveyard for descend purposes, but also giving you an artifact to craft later, because you can use the graveyard to craft. And so this one has been impressive, especially in Dimir. And then I've liked Cogwork Wrestler, but it is one of those that, like, if you're doing the control approach, you don't want Cogwork Wrestler. The more tempo, the more pressure that you're putting early on into the board, the more likely that you're going to get a good trade-off with this. And as time goes on, people are getting better at playing around it as a combat trick. But being able to give something -2, -0 for 1 and flash, and leaves behind a 1/2 artifact that you can then later sacrifice or use for craft, chump block a big dinosaur, it's been very impressive. And it's very similar to like the Deceive the Messenger in Lord of the Rings. And I've liked it so far in every blue archetype that I've been playing. And then there is Join the Dead, and is one of the reasons, or one of the payoffs, I should say, for being in black. It's not one of those cards that will draw me into black, but once I'm in black, then I like to have Join the Dead. And it does work well in Dimir, where you are trying to play some cards that synergize, because it gives target creature -5/-5 for 1 double pit black, but then it has Descend 4, and the creature gets -10/-10 as long as there are 4 or more permanent cards in your graveyard, which you should be able to enable quite easily in this archetype. I've also liked Unlucky Drop, and this one can be a little hit and miss, right? Like if your opponent only has a good card, especially a card that has a good enter the battlefield, it can feel awful at times, right? But during my Arena Open, this card saved me from being able to bounce the Caparocti before it can attack, and then being able to slow your opponent's play down by 2 turns can be life-saving in certain situations. So I tend to have 1 or 2 in my blue decks. And then we've got Sage of Days, which is 2 and a blue for a 3/2, and usually that's a terrible stat block, but I've liked it in Dimir. And the reason is because when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, and you put 1 of those cards back on top of your library and the rest into your graveyard. So it's kind of like a Surveil 3. And but what's nice about this is that it gets you halfway to Descend 4 just by itself. And if you look at like the Puzzle Door also does that, it gets you halfway to Descend 4. And so if you have enough of these cards that get you halfway there, it's pretty easy to get to Descend 4. And it gives you decent card selection. There's been a lot of times where I'll have land 4 already in hand and play Sage of Days and be able to draw into a non-land and put 2 lands into the graveyard for Descend. So I think this is one of the advantages to being in Dimir, is that this is a common that nobody else wants. And so you're able to usually get 2 or 3 copies if that's really something that you want to do. And then the payoffs for Descend 4 from, like Join the Dead becomes a better removal, but you also have Echo of Dusk. And Echo of Dusk is a 2/2 for 1 and a black with Descend 4, and as long as there are 4 or more permanents in your graveyard, it gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. And if you're doing the control thing, this can help stabilize and erase. But what I've really liked it is when you are in a tempo-based strategy, where if you're trading blows with your opponent, and it's just really hard to race the lifelink, so this can swing the battle in your favor. And then we have Deadweight, which is the enchantment I was trying to remember earlier. That's an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets -2/-2 for 1 black. And this one can be good because it's a permanent. It can fill your graveyard counting towards Descend. The reason why I didn't include it in the draft skeleton is that it's a little bit matchup dependent. The more that you're coming up against Jeskai, which has been very popular, so blue, red, white, then being able to remove one of your opponent's flyers for cheap is fantastic. It's terrible against green. If you're up against dinosaurs, there are very few targets other than like their frogs that this can snag, and can just end up being a dead card in your hand. So in best of 3, keep that in mind. If you're coming up against a lot of big creatures in mid-range, you'll want to sub out the dead weights. And Fanatical Offering, I've liked this card more in Orsov than I do in Dimir, but you do have a fair amount of fodder, and this is one of the payoffs to playing like the Cogwork Wrestler, or you can even just sacrifice a map token off of your Waterwind Scout and use this to draw 2 cards, and then it replaces the map token. So this one you can also use it in response to your opponent playing removal, and it depends on what you're trying to do with the deck, right? I think there are some decks that definitely want a Fanatical Offering, and there are some that don't. And like I mentioned at the beginning, typically you would want to be drawing additional cards to try to answer all of your opponent's threats 1-for-1 in a control situation. And so I like it less if you are going into the tempo, which is what I recommend. So you don't want to take a body off of the board, and it is actually quite a big price to take anything off of the board in this format. So tread lightly with Fanatical Offering. But one of the things that it does work well with is Deathcap Marionette. And Deathcap Marionette is a 1/1 with Death Touch for 1 and a black, and when it enters the battlefield, you mill 2 cards. So it helps you, it's another one of those that enables halfway to your Descend 4, and then the Death Touch works really nicely against the green, right? And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems with black is that it's rather matchup dependent, where you can have the right answers for one archetype and then face the other archetype and end up losing. And then Ray of Ruin has been pretty decent. You're able to exile target creature, vehicle, or non-basic land, and the dream is to hit this on a god, because the gods reanimate into a land, and you can hit it when it's in its land form, or you can just exile it and then it stops that loop. But this has been pretty decent, like, you know, high expensive cost removal. And if you are doing the control thing, then you just want as much removal as you possibly can get, and Ray of Ruin's fantastic. In the tempo strategy, I try to keep my curve a little bit lower than the Ray of Ruin, so I decided not to include it in the draft skeleton. And then another chance is a payoff to having the Descend. So you mill 2 cards, so it helps you enable the Descend as well, and then you return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, so technically you can just use this to turn on like Descend 8 and then not touch anything. But if you can access the cards from your graveyard, then it just helps you find your bombs. And the more that you have a creature as a bomb, then the more that you want another chance. And we've got Promising Vein, which is a cave that can tap for colorless, and then has 1 colorless, tap it, sacrifice, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And one thing to note is I actually like Promising Vein in Dimir, even if you aren't doing the cave strategy. And that is because it triggers, it helps you fill Descend by going into your graveyard and smoothing your land draws and helping you not get stuck if you're playing like majority blue and have double pit black for, you know, Join the Dead. On that note, though, I don't recommend the hidden cave lands because you can't afford to stumble in a tempo strategy. But there are cave synergies that work well with Descend because the cave cards count caves that are in the graveyard. So it's just not my preference, since I've found the Descend mid-range strategy to be kind of inconsistent. But if you do find yourself drafting a whole lot of caves, pick up Descend cards like the Sage to help get those cards into the graveyard. And now for the uncommons, and we've got 3 mythic level uncommons, and one of them is Zoetic Glyph. More and more people are talking about how amazing this card is, so I imagine shortly here we won't see them, but I've still been seeing them around pick 5 on occasion, and that's crazy for an uncommon that is of this power level. Being able to turn an artifact into a 5/4 is amazing. I talked about it in Azorius and in Izzet last week, so hopefully I don't have to do much to convince you to try out this card. But it's absolutely bonkers. When it is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you discover 3, so it replaces itself and is definitely worth checking out. Deep Cavern Bat, I've really enjoyed, and it's a 1 and a black, and it's one of the things that will actually pull me into black, at least the one time that I've done it right outside of the Arena Open. The Deep Cavern Bat is a flying lifelinker, 1/1 for 1 and a black, and when it enters the battlefield, look at target opponent's hand, and you exile a non-land card from it until Deep Cavern Bat leaves the battlefield. And because Limited has limited amounts of removal, being able to remove something of your opponent's interaction is fantastic. And then if they use the second piece of removal to get rid of the Deep Cavern Bat so that they get their other removal back, you've already removed one of their things of removal that way. So and then also just the lifelink. Sometimes you can buff this with like a map token and make it into a 2/2 flyer, and then the lifelink can just swing the tempo in your favor. And the third mythic level uncommon is Chupacabra Echo, and this is 2 double pit black, and it's a 3/2 with Fathomless Descent. So this is one of the other cards that gets payoffs for playing the Sages and really leaning into making sure that your graveyard actually has permanence in it, because when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets -X/-X, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. And I've gotten this thing up to a -11, a -11, right? I mean, like you can get this to be absolutely huge and remove anything in the set. And then Spyglass Siren is a solid B in every blue archetype, and in Dimir it's like a B-, partially just because you don't have as good a synergies for the map token as you do in Azorius and Izzet. But I've really enjoyed Spyglass Siren, and it is commonly a pack one pick one for me. Being able to play a 1/1 on turn 1 and then make it into a 2/2 potentially, or help draw your land to hit land 4, has just been a really great way to start off the game. And if your opponent's not doing anything until turn 3, then this is easily a way to run away with the game. And then Abyssal Gorestalker is an interesting card, and I think that if you're going to play it, I originally thought like Orzhov comes to mind because you could play Totes and then you could sacrifice those Totes, but I think Gorestalker performs pretty well in Dimir as well. And you just don't want to end up in a situation where you're playing this and only this to like double edict to your opponent. But even then, there are some times where that's like the play that you need to do. And the fact that this can, you can't sacrifice artifacts, right? Like that's the big downside. So, but this is a payoff to playing the Cogwork Wrestler and putting in a little bit more of that like cheap artifact fodder that are creatures. And then same thing with like the marionettes. You have a couple of fodder that is pretty decent to sacrifice, so I think Gorestalker at least should be a consideration. I didn't include it in my draft skeleton because I have found times where it just completely backfires and I want to keep my curve low. So I decided to go with the Scampering Surveyor. And Scampering Surveyor, you can go get like your Promising Vein and help fill your graveyard that way. And if you are doing more of the cave synergies, being able to look up a cave is pretty awesome. And you can put this with the Captivating Cave that can tap for 4 colorless and tap it to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a flyer. And so like the more interesting lands that you have to go get with this, then the more that I like it. But also just being able to continue to curve out, being able to play this as a 3/2 on 4 and then start getting into your 5 and 6 drops works pretty well if you are doing more of a mid-range late game strategy. So but even in tempo, I like it, at least in theory. And then the Council of Echoes is something that I think that as long as you can get the Descend 4 to work, which you shouldn't have a problem with in this archetype or in Simic to some degree. But being able to play a 4/4 flyer and then bounce one of your opponent's things if you have Descend 4 is just an amazing tempo swing. And I decided not to include it because it is 6 and I wanted to keep my curve low. But I do think that there are decks that want it, and the decks that want it are going to be mostly in Dimir. And then Defossilize is my last uncommon, and this is a payoff similarly to the another chance. Being able to return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield is a way to help find your bombs that are creatures. And then the fact that this explores twice means that the thing that you brought back can come back even bigger with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And you're not really... I save the land cycling reanimation strategy mostly for Golgari, and maybe that's just personal preference, but I do think that like if you have Defossilize, then you can start looking at the land cyclers a little bit more highly. And now for the rares. The top performing rare in Dimir is Kitesail Larcenist, but Dimir is its worst performing archetype. It is a 2/3 flyer with Ward 1. And when it enters the battlefield, you can turn something of theirs into a treasure or one of your things into a treasure. And you don't have as much of like... I think it's still best in Azorius because of being able to turn one of your map tokens into a treasure token so that you can ramp into a big craft mid-range strategy. But it's still, it's still an amazing rare, and you should definitely pick it. And then we've got the Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel, and this one has been impressive. It's a 2/1 flash flyer for 1 and a blue, and then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put a chorus counter on it, draw a card, then discard a card. If there are 4 or more chorus counters on it, you may cast the discarded card without paying its mana cost. And one of the things that Dimir is good at is clearing the skies, right? So like if you are leaning into this blue-black, and this is partly why I was thinking about including the -2/-2, is you can get rid of your opponent's flyers pretty well if that you set out to make that the case, right? And Malcolm would be a reason to do that, because if you can keep the skies clear for Malcolm, Malcolm can just run away with games. And then one of the one black rare that will actually put me into black and make me want to draft it is Preacher of the Schism. And you get a 2/4 death touch for 2 and a black, and whenever it attacks a player with most life or tied, you create a 1/1 vampire creature token with lifelink. And then if you're you have most life or tied, so what? Sorry, one is most life or tied, and then They both trigger if you're tied, but then you draw a card and you lose 1 life. And so it does something regardless if your opponent is ahead or if you are ahead. But the real moment where it shines is where you get to create a 1/1 vampire creature token with lifelink, draw a card, and lose 1 life. Subterranean Schooner has been really great, and works more into the tempo strategy than it does into like a hard control strategy. But even then, it's still an amazing blocker. Being able to change your marionette into a 3/4 is pretty fantastic. And then being able to crew this, the dream that I was really trying to live in my Arena Open was turn 1, the Spyglass Siren into Subterranean Schooner on 2. So that you can start crewing it and buffing your flyers at the same time. And this is this card can just absolutely be too much pressure for your opponent to deal with. And we've only got 1 mythic that really shines to me in Dimir, and that is the mythic black Bat God, which is Alkalazot's The Deepest Betrayal for 3 double pit black. You get a 4/4 flying lifelink, and whenever it attacks, each opponent discards a card, and for each opponent who can't, you draw a card. And then whenever an opponent discards a land card, you create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. And then when it dies, it turns into one of the easiest gods to flip. It turns into the Temple of the Dead, which can transform for 2 and a black back into the god. And if a player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, which by the time this is happening, it's not uncommon for both players to be hellbent. So I've found this one to be pretty easy, especially because it hates on your opponent's hand every time that it attacks, to flip. So next week I'll be covering another archetype. If you have one that you'd like to see, let me know in the comments below on YouTube, or I'm gonna try to place a poll every time that this video comes out. So if you want to vote there, that's the best way to determine what the next archetype will be. And if you're, I hope you did well in the Arena Open. Leave a comment below. Let me know how it went. I love hearing about how your games went. And I hope you did better than I did, because I got close. I got 2-2 on day 2, but didn't quite get there. And I do feel like I got pretty lucky that the set was, the sealed pool that I opened in day 1 was pretty high synergy. And that one's available on YouTube if you'd like to see how that went. And if you found this episode helpful, please help support my dream by taking a moment to hit like and subscribe and leaving a comment. I really appreciate it. And if you want to go above and beyond, you can click join to become a YouTube member. You get early access to some of my videos and some other perks as well. Or you can subscribe on Patreon. And you can always come by and just say hi during my live stream on Twitch. It's every weekday at 2 p.m. East, or 2 p.m. Pacific. And I have a weekly community draft if you want to come kick my butt. That's always a fun time too. Links are in the description below. Thank you for watching to the end of the video, and good luck with your games and future trophies. And thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.